as soon as we can from downtown Tel Aviv. The Israelis are being very guarded about the targets, lest they give any advantage whatsoever to the Iraqis. There are reports also, unconfirmed, that the Israelis are in the process, in conjunction with the United States, of retaliating in some way against the Iraqis for this strike which so many people had feared against Israel. There has also, according to U.S. military sources, been at least one attempted attack on U.S. forces deep inside Saudi Arabia. By this, I do not mean along the front lines where the multinational forces and the Iraqis are so close together, but if we can go to the map, you can see how close the eastern Saudi Arabian main military facility is, where our correspondents have been working, I hope. Want to go to the map, please, as I just asked, to go to eastern Saudi Arabia. So we have an example fairly close up of how far a Scud missile may have penetrated into eastern Saudi Arabia up there around Dhahran, right on the edge of the Persian Gulf. We saw a little bit of videotape earlier on, and there is some speculation, and I emphasize again that it is speculation, that this may have been a U.S. Patriot missile, part of the as yet untested, or at least until this campaign untested, anti-missile defense system which the U.S. has mounted all over Saudi Arabia, streaking into the sky in pursuit of a Scud. Let me look at my notes for just a second to see whether or not there's anything else we need to update you on in terms of the very basics. The White House said earlier today that if Saddam Hussein wants the attacks against his nation to stop, where they continue on a non-stop basis, primarily from the air, then all he has to do is surrender. These are Allied attacks continuing on Iraq and Kuwait. A short while ago, according to ABC's Brit Hume, at the White House, the President issued a statement, or should I say the White House issued a statement, deploring the attack on Israel, and there has been word from the Kuwaiti ambassador at the United Nations and a lot of other people hoping that Israel will cool it. There is no reason to expect why Israel should or would, given the enormous political as well as military ramifications of having Israel and the Arabs involved, as well as a multinational coalition. Now at 10 o'clock, of course, it's a little 3 minutes after 10 o'clock, you would normally see a prime time live at this point, but because of the gravity of the situation, because of the ongoingness of the situation, we are going to continue our coverage in this regard rather than break away for the normal configuration of Primetime Live. But hopefully we will, in the course of the next hour and beyond, cover all the ground which Primetime Live would like to have covered or intended to cover this evening. We'll be back in just a moment.
ABC News coverage of the Gulf War will continue in a moment.
It's now.
Going back to the Scud business and the chemicals, which I think is...
No, do me a favor. Stay with the video for a sec, then we'll come back to the Scuds.
All right.
My apologies.
Any
clues in this video we've just seen from Baghdad?
Well, I had seen exactly the same thing in Baghdad myself when I was out there covering the Iran-Iraq war, when there was a rumor of an Iranian aircraft coming in to make a bomb run on Iraq. It was false, but the city just lit up exactly as shown in that film. There was no airplane shot down, but the people got quite excited about the whole thing, and it is an awesome display. And I think the lesson from this is that even though high-altitude missiles and intermediate-altitude missiles can be taken out by our sophisticated weapons and electronic devices, because most of those types of weapons are indeed controlled by radar and other electronics. But I think what we've seen in that film is the illustration of the inventory of garden variety anti-aircraft weapons that the Iraqis have that are effective below say the 10,000 foot level, that the forces who will be facing the Iraqis on the ground with their close support aircraft and helicopters are going to have to contend with if we go into a ground battle in Kuwait and southern Iraq, because there's no way in the world that our aircraft and fire are going to be able to get all of those, as I say, garden variety type anti-aircraft weapons.
General Trainer, thanks very much. I'll come back to you on the question of Scud and the chemical weapons. I apologize for jumping on you there. I wanted to stay on the point for a second, but to remind people at home, there is now a stand down from our earlier reporting, us and others, that there had been a chemical attack on the Israelis tonight. There was an Iraqi attack on the Mediterranean coast of Israel between Tel Aviv and Haifa, a volley of 8 to 10 Scud missiles, but we are standing down from the reports that there was a chemical component to that. Now let me come to Tony Cordesman and ask you to comment, Tony Cordesman, on what you take out of that video, and we can run it again if you find it's useful. I'm sorry, Tony, stand by for a second. We haven't got your microphone open. Go ahead.
Okay. I have a somewhat different impression from my predecessors. I think General Trainer's points about their total force was perfectly accurate, but that didn't look like a curtain of lead to me. It looked sort of like fireworks and tissue paper. There were really very few weapons. They weren't firing in any kind of orderly way. There were some air-to-surface missile and surface-to-air missiles going off. They might have been effective, but in a practical sense, if you look at those photos, a few guns come up. They probably came long after the aircraft were gone. I wouldn't like to be a pilot watching that behind me, but...
Dispersed with other bullets which give off light to let you know whether you're getting close to the target?
That's exactly it. But while I thought originally I saw some individual flashes, all we've seen are streams of tracers, and look at them. They're going off in different directions. The aircraft could only have flown through one of those streams at maximum. We can't disregard it, but that is not a good performance. That's almost fire for effect.
Now, Tony Cordesman, tell us a little bit about what happens when a cruise missile, because cruise missiles, we are told, were used on targets around Baghdad. A cruise missile is approaching Baghdad from the Persian Gulf. How is it flying? How does it respond to this so-called curtain of lead which is put up into the sky? Does it evade it? Does it keep plowing right on through?
Let's go again back to the term of the curtain. It's a very low-flying missile, terrain following. There's no radar warning, so the radar-guided guns can't hit it. There's no radar detection capability in their surface-to-air missiles that allows them to hit it. At night, there's no optical capability to acquire it. The only way that missile could be intercepted by these guns would be sheer luck. If somehow somebody was firing at random and the missile just happened to fly in it.
Now, a cruise missile, which costs, what, about $1.3 million each to produce, I think?
Well, depending on the model, yes.
They have been fired from battleships in the Persian Gulf. They have been pre-programmed because somebody's got a map and said, this is what it looks like topographically all the way from the Persian Gulf all the way up to the outskirts of Baghdad.
That's right. They use a very complex digital mapping system.
Astonishing. Okay, thank you very much for joining us. We'll get back to both of our military analysts in just a minute. We want to talk in just a moment to the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Neumann, who has joined us, about some of the political complications caused this evening by the attack on Israel. We'll be right back. 7 hours ago, against targets in occupied Kuwait and against Iraq. We haven't had a briefing from the Pentagon in the last 13 hours, 12 and a half to be precise, but the tenor of reporting then was that the first phase of the air operation was going well. There has been no reason to doubt that ever since. There's been source reporting both here and in Saudi Arabia as to how effective the U.S. has been in the air, but then the sudden shock tonight to everybody's emotional system, among other things, when the Iraqis suddenly launched a missile attack against the western part of Israel along the Mediterranean coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa, which has changed the emotional equation and may well have changed the military equation completely in the region if the Israelis have responded. There have been reports to that effect, but perhaps as well as standing down, as we all are at the moment from the earlier reporting that nerve gas was involved, perhaps there is now some standing down from Israeli retaliation. Let's check with Britt Hume at the White House. Britt.
We've been trying to get some confirmation that, in fact, the Israelis have indeed retaliated, and we've not been able to find any officials who can confirm it. And at least one has said that it is not necessarily so, not necessarily automatic that the Israelis would have done so. Now, there no doubt are officials at the top levels of the United States government who know the answer. I think, however, most of them are gathered in the West Wing of the White House right now, and they're not talking to us.
Has, Britt, tonight's activities has just attracted a lot of people to the White House?
Well, they certainly, that's correct. There's no question about that's what's done it. I mean, there would be a team at work over here far into the night to keep the president abreast of what he might need to know, but this was more than the usual gathering. I might also add, Peter, that there was that last line in the statement by the White House that mentioned that coalition forces in the Gulf are attacking missile sites and other targets in Iraq. Well, of course, you and I, everyone knew that. I think, however, that might have been added for effect by the United States government. It made no mention of the possibility of Israeli reprisals. And one further point, Peter, that the word we have gotten about casualties from this attack is that the first word the United States government officials that we've talked to is that they were light.
You're talking about the attack on Israel?
Yes, which could affect, it is hoped, could affect an Israeli decision as to whether to go in there after Iraqi targets or not.
Okay, but thanks very much. In fact, the Israeli military spokesman went on radio. He's been on and off the radio all evening, warning people of impending attacks, warning people they were under attack, telling them to put their gas masks on, telling them to go to the sealed rooms that almost all Israelis had in their homes and offices or their apartment buildings. But he did say a short while ago, and it's the only official word we have so far, that the casualties were indeed light, that perhaps 7 Israelis, don't even know whether they were civilians or military, were injured in this volley of missiles fired by the Iraqis along the Israeli coast. I want to go now to Washington again, where we are joined by the former American ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Newman. My apologies, Mr. Ambassador. It's the spelling of your name which always confuses me. It makes me sometimes think of Neumann.
Well, you're right. It was Neumann many years ago, but it's Newman now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us what you think Saudi Arabia might think about an Iraqi attack on Israel.
Well, I think there's a lot of alarmist talk about the alliance falling apart in the event that the Israelis do make a retaliatory strike. I hope they won't, because undoubtedly that would complicate the situation. Complicate yet destroy? No. Let's look at it. There are 3 Arab countries involved in the alliance: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. Saudi Arabia, are they going to turn out of the alliance, tell us to go home and face Saddam Hussein all by themselves? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. It would be ridiculous. Egypt, they would be uncomfortable, no doubt. But they are so strongly opposed to Saddam Hussein to get on with this job that I don't think the reaction would be that catastrophic.
The wild card here has always been Syria, surely.
Syria is the wild card, and that's uncertain. But Syria has great many interests in staying in this. I don't want to take the time to go into that, or I can if you want me to. But basically, my answer is, Syria is not involved in the operation. It is there for political purposes, very important political purposes, especially if after the war is over, Syria could play a role in the peace process with Israel. That's a possibility.
Are you, I apologize for interrupting you again, but are you saying that Syria is in the coalition because it wants to be a future player at the table?
That's one of the many reasons, but it also wants to be a player against Saddam Hussein. It wants to play a major role in the Arab world. It wants to have power and be visible. Saddam Hussein is a very shrewd customer. But to come back to the point that I wanted to make, Syria may take a more negative stand for a while in order to show its displeasure that the Israelis are in this situation. But I think that would be all, and it would not affect the operations at all. So I wish we would put our shoulders against this roller coaster, at least in that one item. It's not the end of all if the Israelis were to strike back. I hasten to say I hope they won't, because it would complicate matters. It would upset the Arab world, but calm.
I was impressed, nonetheless, on this roller coaster of political emotion to which you refer, that the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United Nations very quickly rushed forward with a statement saying that he thought it would be best if the Israelis didn't retaliate.
Yes, that's absolutely true. It would be best. But if they did retaliate, would the Kuwaitis pull out of it? Well, again, they can't. We're fighting for the liberation of their country. So when you come to emotions, to statements, and also ambassadors, I've been one, make statements in order to create an effect. Not necessarily because the situation is like that. I don't mean to say they're lying. They sometimes come close to it. In this case, the ambassador of Kuwait certainly would agree with me, not on the tube probably, that if Israel were to strike back, the Kuwaitis would stay with us, because they have greater interest.
Well, there is indeed such speculation in Washington tonight that the Israelis may not retaliate. But now impose your former ambassadorial wisdom on the whole day and tell us, as you've watched and listened throughout the day, how much do you think has been said for effect? And can you pick it out quite easily? We're going to hear, by the way, before you begin, from the Israeli ambassador in Washington in about a minute. I may have to cut away from you. I apologize, but please start.
Well, I don't think very much has been said for effect. The Israelis have been very careful in what they say, but that has many reasons, including military ones. I don't know what else there would be that has been said only for effect, except by the Iraqis. The Iraqis, of course, speak only for effect, because what else can they do?
But they do. Do you think strikers have a certain resonance elsewhere in the Arab world, talking as they do today?
My judgment is it has resonance among the Palestinians, which is probably declining. The Palestinians are desperate, especially those who are under
Mr. Ambassador, let me interrupt you. I apologize. We want to go to the Israeli embassy in Washington now to hear from the Israeli ambassador to the United States.
This auditorium, which we usually reserve for cultural events, I have to make the announcement that tonight, Washington time, during the night in Israel, there has been an unprovoked attack by Iraq, launching Scud missiles, or perhaps improved Scud missiles, at purely civilian targets in Israel, jeopardizing the lives of both Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, who live next to each other, are often intermingled, and in a situation where Israel has time and time again declared that it is not part of the conflict with Iraq, it is not part of the coalition, and as a matter of fact, it has remained with a low profile, if you remember that term, for all these months since the beginning of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We don't have exact details as of yet. We understand that there's a possibility that more than 10 missiles were actually launched at Israel. Probably 2 hit the Tel Aviv area, and another one hit the Haifa area. There may have been another hit, but that is not clear as of yet. The missiles in the Tel Aviv area hit a neighborhood in the southern part of the city, inhabited mostly by elderly people and laborers, people who toil for their livelihood. We have so far, and we hope this is a final count, received information that there have been 6 or 7 injured, fortunately not seriously injured, but I don't know the exact details. And there has been considerable damage in property. among other things, because that area where the missiles hit does not usually contain the best of housing, and therefore these houses were probably damaged more than perhaps other houses would have been. Immediately after the information about the missile strike became known, I was in contact with the Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary of State and with the White House, all of whom conveyed their sympathy in the strongest possible feeling, in the strongest possible language. The word mentioned was devastated, and I must say, listening to their voices, they were indeed. And I was asked to convey this message, as well as others, to my government, to my Prime Minister, which, of course, I promptly did. I know that the two governments, or their representatives, have been in contact and are in contact since then. I would like to add only two further comments. Number one, that the government of Israel, and let me add, fully supported by the opposition in Israel, has declared that, of course, Israel reserves the right to respond in any way it would deem fit, without going at the present time into particulars what the decision of the Israeli government in that respect will be. My final comment is that Israel took a very tough decision, knowingly, to risk a first strike on it. We knew that we might be hit. I myself was often asked on TV, do we take these threats seriously? I did say, we all did. We take these threats very, very seriously. There's no reason whatsoever to doubt these threats. Nevertheless, the Israeli government, supporting America's political aims and complying with the United States government requests, decided to refrain from a preemptive attack on those launching pads, on those missile launchers from which we were threatened. We knew that this was a calculated risk. We have now, unfortunately, been forced to give the proof that this actually happened. So far, the state of Israel and the people of Israel, and thank God, the casualties were not more numerous. But so far, the state of Israel has paid the dearest price of any of the countries in the Middle East which have faced Iraqi aggression, except Kuwait itself. And Israel, as I said in the beginning, was not a party to this conflict at all. This is all I have to say. Thank you very much, and good night.
The Israeli ambassador Zalman Shoval speaking at the Israeli embassy in Washington. His last point, perhaps worth considering here with our White House correspondent Brit Hume and our national correspondent John McWethy, because he makes the point that Israel, at the urging of the United States, has refrained from mounting a preemptive strike against the Iraqis. But in fact, Brit Hume, are you there, or John McWethy? Are they both there?
I'm here.
Well, Jeff, I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to go and continue this political point for just a second with our national correspondent John McWethy and Brit Hume, because the ambassador has laid a very pretty heavy trip there on the United States. John McWethy?
Yes, Peter.
In fact, the United States has mounted the preemptive strike for Israel, one could argue. When the U.S. attack began almost 28 hours ago, one of the very first targets were those Scud missile sites in western Iraq, which were closest to Israel. Am I right or wrong?
Well, the United States has launched a preemptive strike in one form, Peter, but the Israelis could certainly argue that those missiles have been there for quite a while, and if Israel felt threatened, Israel also felt restrained by request by the United States not to hit those missiles, perhaps weeks ago, when they may have felt threatened by them. They also felt constrained by the fact that they would have to rely on the United States to do the preemptive striking, and not their own aircraft. And I'm sure the Israelis feel that if their own aircraft had been involved, those missiles would not have hit their territory.
Do we, in fact, take from Ambassador Chauvel's remarks there, then, that the two, they're up here on a map, if we could get our cameraman to take a look at the upper map on the upper left-hand side of the wall there. There are two missile sites on the western frontier, which we've looked at quite a lot today. There's that missile site way over there on the left side of the Iraqi map. That's what has been concerning the Israelis and the United States since before this air campaign began. Our impression has been, John, that they were taken out, or at least very early on, a target for the U.S. Air Force, and that maybe what was used against Israel tonight was mobile missiles.
Well, Peter, the name on the map connotes a base.
Right.
And there are fixed position missiles there, but the whole area has mobile missiles, and the United States has known very well that the Israelis conceal their mobile missiles, move them around, move them from garage-like structures, and they're hard to keep track of.
And is there an understanding here that the Israelis would have been able to keep better track of them than the U.S., you think, in these circumstances?
I don't know that, Peter, except I certainly do know that the Israelis keep extremely close track of things that threaten their country. As they themselves say frequently, it's our neighborhood and it's our country that's at risk. And I'm sure that they would argue that they would pay more attention to it than the United States would.
Okay, so let me go over to the White House now and ask Brit Hume whether or not, from Ambassador Chauvel tonight, we're not hearing, perhaps quite understandably, a considerable level of tension between the U.S. and Israel.
Well, Peter, I rather think that what we're hearing is, as you suggested earlier, the remarks of someone who wants to make sure that his country gets full credit for what it is doing. It is obviously important that the casualties from this attack turned out to be light. And Peter, I just would add this, and you may remember this meeting here when the president met with Yitzhak Shamir a few weeks ago, and there's been considerable tension between those two men, as you're well aware, and the meeting went very well. And Shamir came out afterward and said words to the effect that the president had assured him that there'd be no settlement at the expense of Israel. But we learned subsequent to that the president had said quite a bit more than that the president had given Shamir a reason to believe that the United States was all set to go on the offensive to attack Iraq and to smash Saddam Hussein, and that Shamir was absolutely giddy with delight when he came out of that meeting. He could scarcely conceal it. And so that meeting and what was said there may have indeed created the atmosphere that has led to the restraint that we've seen shown by Israel leading up to tonight and again tonight.
Okay, Britt and John McWethy, let's, while we're talking here, go down to eastern Saudi Arabia to take a look at some of the latest pool video which has come in, because in the general reporting tonight of the Scuds which we've been talking about, 7 of them were launched against Israel, and at least 1 of them was launched against Saudi Arabia. And the one against Saudi Arabia, according to Pentagon sources, was in fact knocked down by a Patriot anti-missile aircraft defense system. Bill Redeker in eastern Saudi Arabia. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Peter, and that is apparently what we experienced and saw here earlier this morning, last night your time, or probably tonight your time. These time zones get a bit confusing. We've had a lull in the air activity here. You probably have heard us report several times that fighter jet aircraft tends to take off on the hour, but that recently started up again in about the last 5 minutes, and we have some pictures of that. These are again the F-15s that are based nearby, taking off, and one assumes heading north.
What do they do, the F-15s, Bill? What sort of a payload do they carry? Where are they going? Far into Iraq, do we know, or to Kuwait?
Well, we have some details of that. They are fully armed and loaded. You can usually tell that by looking at the configuration of the fuel tanks, one under each wing and one underneath the bottom of it. Excuse me, we now have some more activity here. I think
we can hear you over it for the most part, Bill. Please continue.
That was a British Tornado, the ones that we referred to before. They take off from one side of the airfield, and the F-15s take off from the other side. It's usually followed by a second tornado, and I think that's what we're about to hear now from the pause. One other note I'd like to make, and that is that we heard sirens here again for the third time tonight, but not in this part of the city, in another part of the city, and that was reported to us by one of our producers.
Okay, Peter. Bill Redeker in eastern Saudi Arabia. We're at 6:45 in the morning, am I right, Bill, or 5:45 where you are?
It's 6:45.
That's what I thought. It's the same time in eastern Saudi Arabia as it is in Baghdad. Now, Tony Cordesman has been sitting with us again, listening to the Israeli ambassador, Zalman Shoval, on this question of who mounts a preemptive strike. From a military point of view, Mr. Cordesman, what's your comment?
I think it's very difficult for them to show great restraint, Peter. I think we have to remember something. We're not just talking about Scud missiles. We're talking about 3 different types of missiles. And as John McCleffy pointed out, they located 2. The problem is we can't find the other types. They're much more mobile, or at least we have had no indication of where they are. If somebody doesn't go out there, either U.S. or Israeli, they could fire again.
Is it your view that at the moment this will alter the U.S. plan of attack? If these are mobile missiles, and they're as difficult to find as you say they are, if you put the Israeli Air Force up and the U.S. Air Force, do you really double your capacity? Do you make it more confusing? Does it make it any easier for them to find?
I think you do make a significant increase in capacity, but again, we have a problem because we don't know all the details here. They may have been able to knock out most of the missiles with chemical warheads. It may be the shorter range systems with lower payloads, which may only be conventional, that are on the mobile launchers. There are a lot of really serious unknowns here.
Okay, and just before we get too deeply into it, or at least so far into it that I don't understand at all what I'm talking about here, is it, well, how long would Israel have after a missile had been launched? How much knowledge would it have before it actually landed in terms of minutes?
Well, we're talking a maximum of 5 to 6 minutes. That assumes that they have airborne radar and they can look very deeply. Probably they'd only have about 3 to even 1 minute's warning.
And as I think you said to us an hour or 2 ago, the best time to get the missile is on its way up, right?
The best way to get the missile is either on its way up when it's still slow, or best of all, while it's still on the launch.
Okay, Tony Cordesman, thank you very much. Just to repeat here now, what we've been talking about is this question of whether or not, or to what degree the Israelis have shown restraint by not mounting a preemptive attack against Iraqi targets. The Israeli ambassador in Washington saying that no other nation had been called on to show such restraint, and no other nation other than Kuwait, he said, had suffered so much from the Iraqi aggression. Bob Zelnick at the Pentagon.
Peter, the Pentagon has announced that additional missions were added to the number of U.S. sorties that had been planned to be flown against Iraq this evening and tomorrow morning Persian Gulf time, in order that the U.S. itself could undertake strikes against the mobile Scud missile targets in western Iraq, assuming they can be located. This is clearly an effort to soothe Israeli feelings, to mollify them, and hopefully, in the view of the U.S., to keep them from sending up missions of their own and joining, in effect, the war against Iraq.
Anything else there, Bill?
Yes, Peter. We now have official Pentagon confirmation that there was an Iraqi Scud missile launched against eastern Saudi Arabia this evening, and it was in fact successfully intercepted by a U.S. Patriot missile.
Does that mean that we can take it that the video we had from eastern Saudi Arabia earlier of something streaking up into the sky was a Patriot on its way to intercept a Scud?
You sure can, and I believe the explosion that was seen in that footage was the successful intercept.
Okay, this is what we saw some couple of hours ago. You have to go back really to the beginning of that video because you see something streak off into the sky, and it is a Patriot missile. Saudi Arabia is dotted with the Patriot missile. It is designed as a premier line of defense in the anti-aircraft defense system of the United States. It has never before been tested in battle, but there is one instance in which it has apparently been, as they might say, operationally successful. Bob Zelnick, any more?
That's it for this moment.
Okay,
Peter.
just remind me when we are going to get, as far as we know, our next briefing from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell.
That has not been indicated at this time. We are told informally that at about 3:30 p.m. tomorrow, there will be a briefing here, but not, as I understand from General Powell, it's from someone else on the J-2, his staff, but a quite senior officer. Tomorrow morning in Riyadh, we're told there will be a briefing, and I guess the folks there can tell you who the briefer will be. I understand it may be Schwarzkopf.
Thanks very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who is the commander of all Allied forces in the Persian Gulf. We have a couple of other pieces of video to show you in the remaining minutes of this hour, but just to tell you that at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, in about 7 minutes from now, local ABC stations all around the country will have a chance to do their local news, much of which, of course, will involve the Persian Gulf. And then at 11:30, Ted Koppel will be along with a special edition of Nightline as our continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf continues. The two pieces of video I'd like to show you now we've just come in now from the first damage video from Tel Aviv as a result of some of the missiles which were launched by the Iraqis tonight and fell on Tel Aviv. The Israeli military spokesman has said on the radio a couple of times that the casualties were light, that there were 7 people perhaps who we do not know, either military or civilian, though the Israeli ambassador in Washington said they were civilians who were injured. We cannot give you any indication by looking at this video precisely what was hit. But as you've heard from everybody of a military nature on this broadcast, the Scud is in the main, particularly the refined Scud, it's been refined by the Iraqis for a longer range, is a notoriously inaccurate missile. And the Israelis have been very guarded about giving out any of their targets lest the Iraqis pick up any intelligence as to where the missiles they aimed wherever actually landed. We do know this is a southern suburb of Tel Aviv. You heard the Israeli ambassador said this is largely a working-class suburb. It is not altogether too far from the ABC News Bureau in Tel Aviv, which is on the main road outside of Jerusalem. Israel, by the way, has the Patriot missile provided by the United States. To the best of our knowledge, it has not been used this evening, but we don't know very much about Israeli defenses at this point. And just before the end of the hour, here is perhaps the most dramatic picture that we have seen all day. This is what it looked like when the attack on Baghdad began 28 hours ago. This video recorded from one of the upper floors of the Al Rashid Hotel in western Baghdad, where the International Press Corps, that portion of it which remains, has been. And just take a look at what it looked like and listen to what it sounded like to the people on the ground. This is what American pilots described as looking like 104th of the July, everything but the kitchen sinks. Had one American pilot coming up through the clouds, but General Bernard Traynor and Tony Cordesman, our two military analysts who have done such yeoman analytical work for us throughout the day, have said in considerable length tonight that while they pick up some clues here as to the capacity of the Iraqi anti-aircraft capability, General Traynor said this is the kind of thing that low-flying helicopters might face in Kuwait if they try a land invasion there. But Tony Cordesman saying to us that what you see here is, as much as anything else, an uncoordinated and unregulated show. Just a reminder that from 11 o'clock until 11:30 Eastern Time, many of our local stations will cut away for their local news, including Gulf News. On the home front, ABC's Carol Simpson will be here with our continuing coverage. And then at 11:30, Ted Koppel will be along with a special edition of Nightline. That is our continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf, in which, as best we know so far, one American casualty has been the price. I'm Peter Jennings in New York.
This has been ABC News' continuing coverage of the Gulf War.
The sights and sounds of war. These are the first pictures of the ferocious bombing raid that began last night on Baghdad. Videotape taken with a night scope. You can see bombs raining down on the city and some anti-aircraft fire going up. This was the sight that made American military officials initially confident about how the war was going. But now, the winds of war have shifted.
Good evening. I'm Ana Chavez.
And I'm Richard Brown. Just over 24 hours after that bombing began, Iraq managed to fire off several missiles toward Israel from the few Scud missile launchers that were not destroyed by American and Allied bomber jets. Israel has not confirmed at this hour whether it is launching a counterattack, although other sources say it has. Israeli officials did denounce the attack, saying that with the exception of Kuwait, Israel has now paid the dearest price of any nation that has stood against Iraq.
This was a stunned and quiet Tel Aviv immediately after the attack. At least 7 people were hurt by the exploding Scud missiles. Reporters in Jerusalem immediately put on gas masks when they heard the explosions in anticipation that chemical weapons were being used. But a late briefing from the Israeli officials say no nerve gas warheads were used. Still, this twists the balance of war away from the United States and the Allies. The war was going decidedly in favor of American forces. The jet pilots continued throughout the day and night in their bombing runs to Iraq, coupled with dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles. Most of those missiles successfully knocked out their targets, according to Pentagon officials. Those targets included military bases, radar installations, and chemical and nuclear research plants. U.S. officials have not yet estimated Iraqi casualties, though they say just one American fighter pilot is presumed killed. Ground crews were euphoric as wave after wave of jets took off. So were pilots.
I don't think I'll ever become comfortable with the feeling of the fact that, there's a possibility of, endangering one's life, but this particular mission, I did not, I repeat, did not run out of adrenaline.
Captain Steve Tate reported that he shot down one Iraqi jet.
So I just let one Fox 1 go, and about 4 miles in front of me get a huge fireball. Actually get the missile coming off, which is a big flash coming off.
Earlier today, before the attack on Israel, President Bush predicted there would be setbacks.
Is I will not be commenting on the ups and downs, there will be some downs, or the trauma of the moment, a lot of trauma of the moment. But I think it is fair to say, and I will be repeating this to the leaders here, that we are pleased with the way things have gone so far. We are determined to finish what we've set out to do.
An equally determined Saddam Hussein appeared on Iraqi TV. These pictures are thought to be from today, since the streets behind these few well-wishers are deserted. In a distorted television broadcast, Hussein issued his own threat.
The will of Satan and evil in the White House will be defeated.
These American ground troops in Saudi Arabia are waiting to see if and when they will join the battle. With this latest counterattack on Israel, many observers feel almost certain that ground forces will soon see some action. As soldiers fan these flames, the flames of war at this hour are whipping up rapidly. Just this reminder, we will continue to monitor ABC News during our newscast, and we'll switch back to the network immediately if any new information becomes available.
Meanwhile, Jews everywhere are reacting tonight to the direct involvement of the State of Israel in the Gulf conflict. Channel 7's Leslie Brinkley is standing by right now with a report from a San Francisco synagogue. Leslie?
A special service is about to get underway here tonight at Congregation Shereth Israel in San Francisco. A chance for people to get together and share their concern, their anxiety, and I'm also told their solidarity to what has happened to Israel tonight. Joining me are Rabbi Martin Weiner and also Rabbi David Meyer. I might ask you that I know you've held out great hope over the last few days that it wouldn't come to this. What has been the reaction in the community tonight, though?
I think many of us were horrified to see the picture of men, women, children, little babies trying on gas masks and protective gear, and then to see the reality of the rockets coming in, the possibility they might have been gas, and frankly, that they could still be gas on another attack. We're very, very much seeing another chapter in history. Jews being gassed, which strikes a terrible chord for us from a half-century ago.
And in terms of the reaction, it's been one of great sadness. I know I've seen a lot of tears shed tonight. Certainly, the service tonight is a way to get everyone together and to do some praying.
We thought that it was important to have the synagogue open, to have people who would like to come and to pray and to meditate. Jews, for all the centuries that we have suffered, have never lost that sense of hope and faith, and we hope we can affirm that tonight together.
I hope so, too. Other synagogues, I understand, are also open. Now, we spent the earlier part of the evening watching a lot of the early reports coming in at the Anti-Defamation League offices. With family and friends there, do you feel as though they were prepared? How do you think they handled this?
Israel is a country which lives in a bad neighborhood, and there have been widespread and frequent preparations for precisely this moment. One never hopes such a moment will come. We encourage the U.S. and Israel to work together to dismantle this monster before he becomes any stronger.
So intense sadness here at San Francisco synagogues tonight, and certainly news from Israel continues to come in as the community continues to monitor it. We're hoping to have some word from Israel's Consul General for you later on. Anan, Richard?
Thank you, Leslie.
There was no hostility on these faces. There was disbelief that a real war had broken out and misplaced confidence. By first light over Baghdad, the mayhem had silenced. The attack formations and incoming missiles had stopped. There was an eerie calm. This was a city stunned by the gravity and speed of action. Roads were virtually empty, but some motorists were speeding away. It was impossible to report accurately at this stage of the conflict on how much fight was left in Iraq's war machine, or what potential, if any, remained in Iraq's hands to enlarge the war zone with a strike on Israel. The city itself was by no means physically devastated, but it was in mental shock. If Saddam Hussein was not expecting this to happen after invading Kuwait, he made an historic miscalculation. Brent Sadler, ITN, Baghdad.
Now, the cameraman who shot that extraordinary video, I'm talking particularly about the aerial bombardment and, of course, the anti-aircraft maneuvers of the Iraqis. That cameraman is Sebastian Rich, who is standing by now, live in Amman. Sebastian, can you hear me? The way you're shaking your head, you can?
Yes, I can hear. But I'll have to stand you corrected there. That actual footage was shot with a night scope by your own ABC cameraman, Fabrice. The other stuff we had was all ITN material, a company that I work for, but the really spectacular stuff was shot by Fabrice.
Well,
so all credit to him.
Is Fabrice still up in Baghdad?
Well, Fabrice was behind me in a convoy, or supposedly behind me in a convoy. I haven't seen or heard of him for the last hour or so. I'm getting a little concerned.
I was going to ask you how you guys made it out. Now, that's a long drive. It's about a 16 or 18-hour drive, isn't it, from Baghdad down to Amman?
Yeah, it took us 14 hours. What actually happened, communications went down completely in Baghdad. No phones, our Inmarsats, our satellite telephones were confiscated by the authorities. So we were almost ordered out. But what we were told before was that when we wanted to go, we would be escorted by Iraqi officials and militia to the border. What in fact actually happened is that we were given a bit of paper with indecipherable words on it and told to bugger off to the Jordanian border. which we did.
And that's what you did. It's amazing. Did you drive by day?
We drove by day and then well into the night. As we were nearing the Jordanian border, we got caught up in a lot of anti-aircraft fire, and we saw what we assumed to be a cruise missile hit the last of the Iraqi Scud missile bases. Unfortunately, it seems that it hit it rather too late before the missiles got to Israel.
Now,
that's in fact where it came from.
Well, in point of fact, talk to me about that a little bit, because as you can understand, that story is of particular interest tonight. You're saying that you actually saw a missile. Obviously, you can't identify the nationality of the missile, but you're convinced that what it hit was a Scud missile base.
Well, we actually drove through a very known area where the Scud missiles are. Obviously, we don't know whether certain forces hit those missile bases the night before, but we've seen a couple of cruise missiles go up in Baghdad, and I now know what the intensity looks like. So I am pretty sure that's what hit, we think, a Scud missile base, or what was left of one.
Before we go back, Sebastian, and talk about last night and what that looked like, I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about your journey from Baghdad to Amman, because if, in point of fact, you were driving through in a sense, a field of Scud missiles, I would assume that that's rather heavily guarded. Were you stopped at any points, and did you have any fear that you wouldn't be able to get through?
Well, yes, of course. There was. We actually. It's a very, very good road from Baghdad up to the Jordanian border, but the sites are obviously well off the road. We were stopped innumerable times by militias and police and so forth. Yes, and we were very concerned for our own safety, because we're driving that close. We knew that the Americans were very, very surgically bombing all targets and being extremely accurate.
Now,
we didn't want to be part of that.
How many cars were in the convoy, and who all was coming out? Was this essentially what was left of the Foreign Press Corps, or are there still some left up there?
There are still some left there, some from my own network who've opted to stay to see it out. They, unfortunately, are now completely trapped because they don't have any communication whatsoever, and I do fear for their safety. The convoy that left was our network, ITN. ABC was some little ways behind, CBS and French network, and WTN, which is World Television News.
Now, forgive me for being a little bit parochial here, but who all was in the ABC car, and as you say, you were in convoy. Were you close together? Were the cars close together?
No, unfortunately, it's a slightly chaotic convoy. I think ABC were the last to leave in the convoy. We actually, our drivers are getting very, very twitchy indeed, and we had to go, otherwise we'd run out of daylight. In fact, we did run out of daylight, and ABC were the last to leave. And as I say, the convoy was somewhat fragmented, and all I know is that the BBC, who are with us, are now back safe and sound, and as you can see, we're back, but as far as I know, the ABC crew have not arrived.
And what about the CBS crew?
CBS crew, I don't know either. I've literally been back half an hour, and obviously I've been debriefed, if you like, by my network, and as soon as I've done this, I will go and see if I can check out the guys.
Yeah, I can imagine it's been an extraordinary couple of days for you and couple of nights. Take me back now to last night, if you would. Where were you physically during the bombardment?
You mean the first bombardment?
Yes.
In Baghdad?
In Baghdad.
Yeah, well, we were actually in, it's probably not very good for you, but we're in the CNN Cable News Network office on their 4-wire, talking to London, and our London office had just made the decision to pull the whole group out of Baghdad on the grounds of safety. No sooner had we put down the 4-wire and walked into the hotel corridor, we heard ack-ack fire. We dived into an open doorway of someone's bedroom and saw great streaks of light go up, and then what we found out later to be the flash and enormous explosion of a cruise missile. The then immediate gut reaction is we ran down to the bomb shelter, a very secure place in the bottom of the Al Rashid Hotel, and then gathered our senses and climbed back up the stairwell of the hotel to place our cameras in the windows. And as you can see, Fabrice from your network got some quite amazing pictures.
Now, how long did the attack go on?
The attack went on sporadically through the night, but it started at approximately 2:45 in the morning, and the intensity was for about an hour and a half, at great intensity, and then it slackened off. The air defenses from the Iraqis, I think, were more colorful and pretty than effective.
Sebastian, what we have been hearing from Eastern, and we're taking a look at some of that video now while I'm talking, so you don't have to squint into that bright light so much. But what we've been hearing from Eastern Saudi Arabia is that there is just wave after wave after wave of aircraft, U.S. aircraft, British aircraft, Saudi aircraft, heading over Iraq, and we've had the sense that Iraq has been under almost continual aerial bombardment for the past 24 hours. And yet I get the sense from you that it lasted a relatively short period of time. What happened after that? No more bombing?
Well, no, but yes, there was, as daylight hours came up, there was, it intensified once again from about 9 o'clock onwards. We left, as I say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then bombardment continued at 3 o'clock, just an hour after we left. And I do know that the CNN network had cut their conversations and took refuge in the bunker.
Now,
yes, I mean...
Yeah, go ahead, Sebastian.
Yeah, I mean, I have since learned that, you know, central Baghdad is under very heavy bombardment.
Now, what about on that road from Baghdad down to Amman? I realize it's a huge country, but did you ever see any formations of aircraft flying overhead?
No, nothing at all, nothing whatsoever. We just saw a few Iraqi military trucks and the guys that stopped us and searched us. I mean, the material that you've been watching, the Brent Sadler cut spot, was spent 14 hours in my underpants. So it's it was a little bit sweaty for your editor to cut.
Yes, well, it gives us particular relish to know where it's been, Sebastian. But the as far as the bombardment is concerned, I'm just astonished that you folks were actually allowed to make it out and that you weren't accosted in any way by Iraqis when you were. Did you walk through the streets at all? I mean, before you came out?
Well, no, we weren't allowed to take the cameras into the streets, but we were allowed to look around, and we did see that the Ministry of Defense building had taken what appeared to be 3 hits, and the telecommunications tower had the back missing off it. But back to being accosted, yes, we were fairly well strip searched at the Jordanian border. I do know that NBC's material was taken off one of the carriers. I think the BBC were carrying NBC's rushes and cut spots, and they were taken off. All photographic film was ripped out of cameras, certainly out of my camera and Agency France Presse. I think photographer. They were physically removed out of the cameras.
Now, did you have a chance to walk through the streets of Baghdad at all before you left?
Only outside the hotel. It's just before we left, as I say, the ACACs were starting again, and it was ill-advised to go walking in the streets.
All right, Sebastian, anything you feel I've left out? I realize you probably want nothing more than a hot bath and to go to bed and go to sleep, but, yeah, go ahead.
I'm looking forward to having a hot bath and going to sleep. My main concern is that your crew and everyone else's crews get out safely. I think that's going to be a problem for them because, as I said before, law and we were under very strict control in Baghdad. We always had a minder or a government official came out everywhere with us where we were filming. Now that seems to have gone, as we say in England, straight out of the window. Everyone is just left to what appears to fend for themselves. So my main concern is that the rest of my team get back, your team get back, and everyone else gets the hell out of there.
Well, that certainly echoes our concern, too, and congratulations. We're awfully glad that you're out safely, and obviously our prayers go out to our ABC colleagues who are, I hope, on their way out, and if you see them, tell them to call quick, will you?
We will, as soon as I can.
Sebastian Rich, cameraman for ITN, just back from Baghdad in Amman, Jordan. I'm going to take a quick switch now from Amman back here to Washington and to the Pentagon, where our Pentagon correspondent Bob Zelnick is standing by. Bob, you have new information on additional casualties?
Yes, Ted. Sources in this building say that a second Navy plane is missing and in all likelihood shot down over Iraq as a result of action this evening. The first one that you reported was shot down by a surface-to-air missile over Iraq last night. As far as any other details, there just not existent right now, not even whether it was an A-6 or an F-18 or whatever type of plane.
But you're still under the impression, Bob, as we are, that the sorties are just continuing in an almost endless stream. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. In fact, if anything, we've heard that the bombardment and number of sorties over Iraq may even be greater than last evening. Not only are they searching for additional targets and going after additional targets, but there are some that are being revisited because they were damaged but not fully destroyed in last night's action.
All right, Bob Zelnick, thanks very much. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more in a moment. Front was, of course, with the exception of those 2 Navy jets that have been shot down, exceptionally positive today. And the good news led to a rather unique feeling of euphoria throughout the country after many days of nervous tension. But is that feeling premature? Here's Nightline correspondent Jeff Greenfield.
For 1 minute this morning, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange was silent, a solemn salute to the men and women of Desert Storm. Then the trading day began, with a huge cheer, as if a favorite football team had just scored the winning touchdown. The euphoric explosion seemed to celebrate the news that the war had begun with apparent success, almost bloodless in terms of American lives. That sense of triumph was apparently shared by investors across the country, who drove the market up by more than 114 points, the biggest one-day jump in more than 3 years. In the Gulf, some of the flyers, just back from the first missions of the war, talked like members of a winning team.
It's just like a football game, too. Once you get airborne and you get the jet under you and you start feeling good, then you just start working your game plan.
It's like being a professional athlete, never playing a game. Today was the first game, and the enemy didn't show up. The opponent didn't show up. We went out there and ran our first play, and it worked great. Scored a touchdown. There was nobody home.
And there were words of exultation on the floor of the House of Representatives.
Slam, bam, thanks to damn. You should have took the letter. Now take the loss, reverse the course, because it ain't going to get no better.
Give it up, Saddam. You have no more Scuds left. Give it up, Saddam. You virtually no Air Force.
This wasn't the tone most of official Washington was taking. In fact, they were at pains to dampen complacency.
So while we feel very good about the progress to date, it is important, I think, for everyone to be careful about claiming victory or making assumptions about the ultimate cost of this operation in terms of casualties.
We have to guard against an emotional roller coaster which sees this optimism now leave us vulnerable to some bad days that could still lie ahead.
As it turned out, the bad days were closer than anyone had realized.
And I don't know if you can see the picture of the Tel Aviv skyline, but we are hearing now the air raid siren going off in Tel Aviv.
Dean, let me interrupt you.
What had been a day-long exercise in speculation about Saddam Hussein's possible surrender timetable suddenly lurched into a surreal nightmare. Reporters in gas masks tried to bring order out of chaos. Iraq's missiles had not been completely erased. Missiles, in fact, had landed along the coast of Israel, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv.
5 Iraqi Scud missiles have hit in and possibly around Tel Aviv in Israel.
There have been 6 missile hits in Tel Aviv.
As many as 8 and 10. We cannot tell you yet what damage they have done.
Suddenly, the grimmest scenarios out of a Gulf War were becoming the stuff of rumor. Casualties in Israel, nerve gas victims taken to hospitals, a report later knocked down by the Israeli military. The Saudi Arabian city of Dhahran, threatened by an Iraqi missile, shot down by a U.S. Patriot missile.
There are unconfirmed reports, and I emphasize these are unconfirmed reports, that Israel has now launched something of an attack.
Though denied by official Israeli spokesmen, the possibility of Israel's entry into the war is precisely what Washington has